Lovely to start this conversation. And it's a great pleasure to welcome you to Conversations with Indica. And just a short introduction about yourself. Aseem ji is now advisor of the Center for Embodied Knowledge of Indica. And he will be sharing his vast experience and his intellectual wisdom with all our mentees as well as with us. Welcome, Aseem ji.
Thank you.
You've just finished a workshop at Bangalore. Could you just tell us about what was the agenda, if there was one, and what could the participants have taken away from a workshop like this?
That's actually a good question because it will take us into the heart of ecosophy. So, two of my students and I, we organized this workshop at the request of Bhumi College, which is an institution in Bangalore associated with Prakriya School. And the people attending were mostly teachers and faculty of Bhumi College and Prakriya School, as well as parents of children who study there. So most participants were between, let's say, 30 and 50, some a little older. And we kept it simple, but it was deceptively simple in the sense that we put a question as the title of the workshop: what is a home? What is a home? Dialogues on ecosophy. And by provoking that question, or provoking people with that question, we managed to get into issues of what is a family, what is a community, the place of gender in human relationships, and what all this has to do with the ecological crisis. So people do not easily make the connection that the devaluation of the home that has happened in recent times, I would say it began with the Industrial Revolution, and then it continues on and on. And in India, in the last 30 years since the so-called reforms era began, I think you've had a steady devaluation of the home and what one might call the hotelization of the home in metropolitan areas of the country, which is part of a trend which is quite global. So this commercialization of society and the hotelization of the home is part of the same story which actually is contributing to the ecological crisis of the earth, because we have ceased to look upon the earth as home, as our only home in the cosmos. And we look upon the earth as a source, as a standing reserve of raw materials and resources to be exploited for our own benefit and growth and so on. So this breakdown of our relationship with the earth is mirrored in the weakening of the home as the locus of human existence. A hotel can never take the place of a home. So this was the substance of the workshops. And on both the days, we had between 25 and 40 people attending. So they were, well attended, as well as very well discussed for about 2 hours each.
Sorry about that. It's interesting you use the word hotel, and David Attenborough, I've been just watching some of his videos, which are like really interesting in how he curates and delivers them. He says, like, from being a part of the universe, we've now grown apart. So even the way we see nature is something that we have to do outside the city. It's a vacation, it's a trek to a remote mountain or to a village. It's always apart from our daily lives. So just like the home, which it's not integral to everything. So how do we bring in the focus right at the center, Aseem? Like instead of this breaking up of identities and our disassociation with nature, how do we bring it closer to ourselves even while we are in urban milieux?
Yeah, well, that is the challenge, and that is the big question as to how human civilization will learn what is necessary and learn it in time. Um, you see, the way we treat the natural world is very closely related to and mirrored in the way we treat each other and the way we treat ourselves. You look at our vocabulary today. So human beings are human resources. When we invite somebody for a workshop, we say they are resource people. The work that so many people are trying to make a difference to the way human society is organized today, is referred to as the social sector. So society has been reduced to the social sector. Sector of what? Obviously a sector of the economy. This is new in human affairs. That's what people fail to realize. People think that this is normal, but this has been normalized over some generations. Any pre-industrial culture or non-industrial culture would find this absolutely strange and odd that society is being referred to as social structure, social sector, human beings as human resources, and so on. And I mean, it comes down to little things of how we communicate in language. For instance, so many people, if not most people nowadays, use the conjunction that to refer to a person. So they will say, the friend that I met in Bangalore. And that's supposed to be correct. In our school days, in the convent school I studied English in, that would have been red marked. You use the pronoun, the right pronoun who, and not that. The person who I met there or the friend who I knew there, to denote the difference between subject and object. Human beings are not objects. That has been completely misunderstood across the world today, beginning with the Western world. So this objectification of humanity, first the humanity of others, eventually our own, is related to the objectification of nature. So once it enters the cognitive apparatus of a highly educated metropolitan mind, that we are basically objects, and nature too is an object, the entire relationship gets distorted. The entire matrix of human relationships to nature, to the rest of human society, and to oneself, everything gets colored and distorted by that simple mistake which everyone is making in terms of how we perceive things, right? Or how we perceive beings. So beings are not exactly things. But that's, I think, at the root of the problem. So it has to enter the methods of education and schooling from the very beginning, from the cradle. And teachers, parents, elders, anyone in charge of raising children should be utterly mindful of this. Now, we are living in a world where parents, teachers, and elders are not the ones raising children. The ones raising children are the marketing divisions of big, giant global corporations who have enormous reach, enormous wealth, and promote their products. They will sell anything to anyone. Now, in that sort of context, the values of a child growing up today are going to be values which objectify humanity, which objectify the self, which objectify the natural world. At best, what you will get is a sometimes the concession would be made in terms of seeing the self as a subject, others as objects, and nature as object. And in a greater concession, the self as a subject and maybe others as subject, but nature certainly is not a subject. Nature is an object. Now, that's where the problem lies. It's a very deep cognitive crisis, in my opinion, which can only be corrected gradually through education of the right kind. But that education will require a volume of unlearning and very mindful unlearning, which will require a disciplined approach and the kind of uh, abstinence from smartphones and so on, which are actually leading people to form very distorted views of the world from a very young age. So I view the ecological crisis fundamentally as a cognitive crisis, which has material outcomes and relationships. I do not take the view that it's just the economy or it's just the consumption patterns. Those are outcomes of a much deeper crisis of cosmology or worldview that modernity is afflicted with today. So that cognitive disease will have to be addressed sooner or later. And the stakes are as high as we know them to be.
Would it help, like, for instance, if we talk about things like climate change, which is not very visible to youngsters, but I just came back from a small workshop in Tiruvannamalai, and there they have buildings made from sustainable material, and they have a pond around the house where all the water from the house goes into that pond where you have fishes and you have plants, and any chemicals introduced in the house immediately reflects on the world, on the pond, and the creatures that live in the pond. So the children living in the house immediately know if there's something wrong and if they've used something that is not compatible to life in water. So if kids were made aware of the impact of their actions with, as basic systems like this, would it help them to learn the consequences of their actions rather than tell them about very big microcosm, huge impact things like climate change?
Yeah, I think that perception as well as mobility begin at home. And I think that if through simple shifts in ways of living, if children can be made aware of the long chain of cause and effect, which leads to complex ecological outcomes in the macro, I think that that would be worthy education. I think if children can grasp things at a very direct, simple, everyday perceptual level, that'll enable them cognitively to grasp bigger things. Then I think, people would be led to ask questions. Young people would be asking questions then about how does that come about from here and so on. And people would be led to examine their very personal, sometimes intimate decisions about how they live. Now, truth be told, there's not that much that mere lifestyle choices can do. I think they play a big role, no doubt, but it's a small drop in a very large ocean. And, for instance, I mean, individually, I would like to live in a city where I can get by with walking, using bicycles, and occasionally public transport. And that's it. But how much choice do I have to live like that if I have to look after my parents who are living in a metropolitan area like NCR? I don't really have that choice very much. The roads are a hazard for pedestrians and cyclists. You really can't walk 15, 16 kilometers or even bike 15, 16 kilometers. We used to do that, by the way, in our college days in this same city. Traffic was about 5% or 1% of what it is today, 30, 40 years ago. These are social, structural problems, and they will ask for institutional answers. They can't be solved by individuals. This is the big mistake which people are making. They're carrying humongous amounts of environmental guilt on individual consciences without thinking through what is really precipitating the situation in which we are making obstinate choices, between rocks and hard places. Our options are bounded very severely by the power of the state and the power of the corporation today. And unless that is understood through education, I don't see how a situation can change fundamentally.
You've studied economics in the US, essentially, and like a lot of bad press comes to India about its, maybe the pollution or its for deforestation. But it's an obvious fact that our carbon footprint is much less than that of the West. So when we talk of global solutions, and you also have talked about the information age, do we look at very localized, even if it is institutionalized solutions, or do we have a pan-India solution, or do we have a global solution? Right now, I think everything is politicized and there's a one message for the whole world. So where does India fit into this guilt journey?
Well, I've always been raised wealthy, shall I say. Let me speak for myself and my family. I think that it's very obvious to me, given my education and exposure, that we hide behind the poor. So, you see, what the West says about India is significantly right, and what India says about the West is also right. When I want to know if a place is racist, I will talk to those who are suffering from racism. If I want to know if a place is sexist, I will speak to those who are suffering from sexism. Nobody in this world is telling the truth about themselves. That's where the problem lies. Now, the truth is that in the name of the poor and in the name of development, a handful of Indians, which is to say less than 10% of the country, has enriched itself to first world standards, if not better in so many cases. The wealthy in India are globally wealthy. They would be globally wealthy anywhere. The NRIs are the richest ethnic group in the US. It used to be the Jews once upon a time, but they've been displaced by Indians. So Indians of privilege are right at the top of the world today. There is nobody beyond them, barring a very handful of wealthy white men. But in the name of development and removing poverty and so on, if we are going to enrich a small number of us and then do the carbon numbers as though everyone is equally responsible, I think that's not only delusional, that is criminal. That is dangerous. That is very dangerous for us. Or to espouse a view such as something which was expressed by Captain Gopinath, who used to be the chairman of Air Deck when it was operative, that his goal is to make enable every Indian to fly. This was in the in-flight magazine of Air Deck. Now, if that's the kind of aspiration you set for 1.4 billion Indians, that they should be able to live like Americans, it's seriously delusional. And, I think the Earth will not tolerate it, and we will be thrown off. We'll be finished off with some generations. So these kinds of aspirational fantasies need to be set aside. We need to face facts. We need to face the reality that many of us have climbed ladders of consumption against walls which are falling or possibly not desirable. Like, for instance, I personally have deep distaste for flying for all sorts of reasons. And I've tried to reduce my, air travel significantly. I don't travel abroad now. I haven't even renewed my passport. Now, I think that I do that because I don't want to set bad examples continuously and communicate through my actions to people that this is something wonderful and desirable and everybody should be living like this. because that's what I do every time I make a air booking. So isn't it much wiser to communicate that, look, the way I am living is also not sustainable. This is not really a good idea for our children and grandchildren and for the future of life on Earth. And to make the necessary, quote unquote, sacrifices. They don't even seem like sacrifices, actually. It's just common sense. Everybody can't live like this. It's bad enough that so many of us are living like this. And you see, the way mobility has grown in the world, the speed of transport and communication has grown at such, galactic pace that families have gotten divided, neighborhoods have got broken. The neighborhood is not what it used to be a generation ago. So in the 30 years ago, most of my friends were within a stone's throw of where I was living. Even in the US, when I was studying and working in the US, most friends were, within reach. Now you have friends on all continents. You have family on all continents. And just to be able to sustain those relationships, you need to fly. Now, is there an individual solution to this? I don't think so. There has to be a structural realization by elites around the world, because they have a terrible responsibility to not only reduce their footprints, but to set the right example and to stop this kind of rampant flying and having, holidays abroad or their destination weddings on islands and so on. If these are going to be the aspirational avenues we're going to open up to the rest of the world and pretend to democratize consumption and say everybody should be entitled to this, that's idiots, paradise, So this is the kind of structure, what I call structural ecological idiocy that is going on. It's relevant, it's so common that it doesn't have to be belabored. But how little is the reflection on it, and how few are policy moves in the direction which would actually discourage people from this kind of way of living. So when it comes to India and its responsibility for climate change, we are severely deluded. Every single government, every single minister, every single powerful decision maker is severely deluded in thinking that first world standards are what we have to meet. Or even Asian standards at their best, that is to say Japan and South Korea and so on. I don't think that can be ecologically possible in a democratic society, which is to say that if you want most of your people to live like that, it's not possible. The resources for that do not exist on Earth. So therefore, something else needs to give way. Some other weak link in the system, in the way of life, has to change. And to me, it's quite obvious that what needs to happen is a major policy shift at a very structural, bipartisan level, which would not only nationally set an example to the whole of this country, but globally set an example to other countries, that the way the West has looted and exploited the earth is not the way to live, and we are not going to do that. But right now, what are we doing? We are trying to move from economy class to economy plus to business class to first class. And that's, so it seems like, we are socially, culturally programmed to gain global status. And so long as status is your parameter and that's the level on which you compete, there will be mortal ecological crisis, because it happens through the avenue of resource consumption and use.
Absolutely. Most of us are influenced by our family. So your great grandfather Jai Prakash Lalji, his vision of life, and how he set about accomplishing what he wanted, and the subsequent generations. Do you see your work and your thought process as being flowing from that, and how much of it is influenced by your childhood, or is it like sometimes it's reactionary and it's a protest against something we experience?
That's a very interesting but complex question to answer. One small correction, my great-grandfather was actually Harihar Prasad Singh. My great-great-grandfather was Jai Prakash.
Right. Okay.
Both of them were actually decorated British subjects during the Raj. They were Rai Bahadur and so on. And they were highly, highly privileged feudal aristocracy from Bihar. And they got huge land grants both in Bihar and in then Burma, now Myanmar. And they made good on it. They were very successful entrepreneurs who converted from feudalism to capitalism very successfully and made a big fortune. And I'm not saying they were only exploiters, they were also great benefactors. And I think they gave employment and livelihood and ways of life to literally tens of thousands of people, both in Burma and in Bihar. So they were in a world in which the relationship was one between, if I was to use our language, I would say Raja Praja. Raja Praja ka rishta hota hai. So they had a very strong sense of noblesse oblige, caring for the poor, caring for those who were dependent on them. So they had the best of patriarchy in the sense of the highest values of valor and honor and responsibility. So I greatly respect them for everything they did for the world around them. But one has to realize that the world has changed between, say, 1920, 1930, and today. In these 100 years, among 100 other factors that have shifted, world population is about four or five times what it used to be, or maybe 3 or 4 times what it used to be then. India's population is about 3-4 times larger. The pressure on land and resources is enormous. And then one has to understand that technology has shifted in such ways that the human capacity to both grow as well as destroy is enormously greater globally. And then living standards have risen so much that the lives of so many middle classes around the world are at a higher standard of living today than the aristocracy living in those days. I mean, they returned from Myanmar when the Japanese began bombing Burma. They returned from Myanmar. A small part of the family returned on a chartered plane, but the rest of them came on elephants through the jungles of Mandalay and the Northeast, and took several weeks of dangerous terrain and walking and so on to make it. So times are very different and values are very different. What I have tried to do is try to understand their context and their worldview in relation to that context and learn something from that, not by blind emulation at all, but by critical assessment. But the part of my family which I've drawn on more actively and usually failingly is the female side of my heritage on both sides of my family. The women are the ones who've been the carriers of the highest values, both in a socially aristocratic sense and in a general human sense. What they have left behind, and especially by way of culture, especially by way of everyday courtesies, everyday concerns, compassion for others, religious, spiritual values, deep belief systems. I wouldn't even call them systems, they were practices, which are ongoing. And the women in my family, my mother, my aunts on my father's side, my grandmothers when they were alive, they've all carried this. And so, I do value that very greatly. And I think we are at a point of time in history where men's last chance is to learn from women. And, women's last chance is to refuse to become like men. And if we are able to do these two things, we will solve the ecological crisis. If we cannot do this, we will not solve and we'll be destroyed by it. That's how I see things and how I see my filial sort of lineage in the larger picture.
How beautifully put. And just to sum it all up, Aseemji, thank you for this lovely conversation. Just one last thought on what do you see the Center for Embodied Knowledge doing going forward? What can it hope to achieve in this big ocean of change that's required? And what would your role be in this?
Again, it's a complex question. It's a big question. First, let's ask the question, what leads to the idea of embodied knowledge? How did knowledge get disembodied in the first place? How did this kind of mere intellectualization become knowledge? The intellect has its place. Nobody denies it. I'll be the last one to deny it. But how did it get divorced from the rest of the human psyche and from the rest of human experience to the point where this body becomes something alien to me almost, and over which some doctor or some hospital somewhere has control and sovereignty, and I do not relate to it as though it's exactly my body and some awareness and knowledge of it directly. So this whole process needs to be understood, and we have to find ways and means of public education through which this process of cognitive distortion or imbalance is traced to its roots in what I would think of as the scientific revolution that took place in Europe in the 17th century, which is where most of the modern worldview develops from. So the French philosopher René Descartes, when he divides mind and body in his famous meditations, that becomes pretty much the basis of scientific investigation thenceforth. And the enormous success of Cartesian dualism, the division of mind and body, and the fact that so much of math and so much of science and so much of technology got built atop that from the 17th century onwards, has created this enormously productive and dynamic world of modern technology. Its power can't be underestimated. It sends man to the moon and outer space and so on. It's enormously powerful. However, we also know that our feet are on earth and we can't stand outside the earth to look upon the earth. We can't stand outside our bodies to look at our bodies, which should humble us, which should tell us that our physical, somatic limitations are there. Normal thinking nowadays, insofar as people believe in the existence of a soul, they think that the soul exists in the body. And that's not the way I think about it. I think the body floats on the soul. The body has to become aware that it is floating on something which is much bigger than itself. All our mantras, Gayatri mantra and Mahamrityunjaya, and all the great mantras and shlokas of the Upanishads are a reminder that, if the spirit is awake, then that's how we will experience reality. There is a reality infinitely greater than us, which informs our life, which illuminates our minds. That's what the Gayatri mantra is about. If we are fortunate and if our prayer is honest and authentic. Now, this entire worldview has to come back. And this entire way of looking at the cosmos, looking at creation, looking at humanity's place in the universe, has to make a return, which is not possible without due humility and without understanding that there are intelligences in the universe greater than the human mind. That is not accepted by the modern mind. The modern mind is too arrogant in accepting that. So when it comes to embodied knowledge, I think the first thing to understand is that the body is a locus of intelligence. The body has an innate intelligence, an innate wisdom, which the mind can often not comprehend at all. And there has to be some humility in acknowledging that nature is ever so much subtler than the human intellect. This was said by none other than Francis Bacon. This is not of my invention, but Sir Francis Bacon, the inventor of modern science, said this in the 17th century. I'm merely re-quoting him. So once we understand the subtlety and complexity of the natural world, including our bodies, then I think we will be on our way to understanding what embodied knowledge is. What is it that the farmer who is moving the plow on the field knows that Dr. M.S. Swaminathan did not know? What is it that the grandmother who knows how to prepare a good meal is not known to the nutritionist who knows everything about what's a good diet, but without being able to turn out the right meal? So, learning by doing, or doing as being, doing of a certain kind, not every kind, doing of a certain kind as being, will reduce the distinction between being and knowledge. Right now, being is one thing and knowledge is another thing. And this has been happening since the European Enlightenment, pretty much. That has to go if we want to come to grips with the ecological crisis of contemporary culture. So for Center for Embodied Knowledge, I mean, potentially the agenda is vast, but more than vast, I like to think of it as deep, and I like to think of it as something which has to address the great questions in very simple, direct ways, and tap into the enormous potential of this country and its cultures to actually identify individuals and communities, groups of people who are in a position to experiment with knowledges of the embodied kind, and who can actually learn from communities who still have those embodied knowledge coded into their everyday life. They will not know the expression, they will not know the words, but they're actually practicing the reality. We may know the words, but we don't know the reality. So that's the kind of world we are living in since Macaulay's time. And I think that the duty of anybody concerned with embodied knowledge is to restore this balance between psyche and the soma, or the body.
I was just reading a quote by Sri Aurobindo, where he says that we are always given these messages based on intuition, and over time, because of this scientific kind of mass development, we have given science authority over intuition. So we keep suppressing this sense of what we think is right, and instead credit science of knowing what is right. So probably the people whom you mention are people who are still listening to this intuition which is there within all of us. And maybe the rest of society has given that key to science to control.
See, the confusion is because the illusion spread far and wide from the West that science gives us the truth. Science never gives us the truth. Science gives us the best possible intelligible explanation of observed facts. Truth is another matter. Facts by themselves do not move us. Truths move us. Why is that? And that distinction must be kept. So truth is potentially infinitely greater than fact, has a certain relationship to fact, but is not reducible to it. But if we make the mistake of thinking that science is the whole thing, that's all there is, then we will destroy culture and humanity.
Thank you so much.